Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to The Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome in, everyone. You're with The Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey and with co-host Peter Bale in Hoon Bay. Peter, fantastic to see you. Very good. I'm bright and sparky. And,
after your naked swim on the... Do we tell people which beach you go to? Or
too late now. Yes, I go for a lovely unclothed swim most days on an island in the Hauraki. And it's very cold at the moment, but the sparkling blue sky and sea was just the best thing ever today.
I didn't know you lived on Terituri Matangi, actually.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
No, I had a wonderful time. It's amazing what being out and about in the bright sun, and some of the flowers are coming up, and the tui and the
hello
kiriru
flowers, hello world. Jesus.
Well, every day I put into the bottom of my email newsletter for subscribers a timeline cleansing nature pick, which is me getting
a throat. You just say palate cleanser.
Bit like that, timeline cleanser, and usually it's a picture of a flower or a bird. And tomorrow I've got a cracker. It's got a tui and a kiriru sitting together on
in the same picture.
Yes.
Oh, that's so impressive.
And the tui is singing to the kiriru.
Well, that's what you think. I think is there a bit of anthropomorphization there?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, love them both.
Well, since we're both okay, so last night I was out on my terrace after dark doing what I call gardening, which is really just tending to my terrace plant, my potted plants, because I don't have a proper garden anymore. And I'm into the birds, but this most extraordinary thing happened. It was after dark, maybe 8 o'clock. 20 perhaps royal spoonbills flew over in convoy.
Wow.
Looking like completely mad Dr. Zeus birds flying over from my place, presumably somewhere like Western Springs where they quite like to hang out. But they just looked, it was like watching storks come over delivering children under their little beaks. It was really weird, but good, beautiful.
Fun. Oh, yeah. No, so nature is good.
Yeah, nature is good. Oh, I think we can get some Kaka t-shirts printed saying that, can't we?
Not bad. Nature is healing.
Kaka merch. We don't have enough Kaka merch going on at the moment.
More Kaka merch, yes.
Yeah, indeed. Kaka gin. I think Kaka gin would be, or Hoon gin. Hoon. Actually, I think we're on something there. Hoon gin could be big.
Yes, good fun.
It might go to the wrong market, but it's might run the wrong segment. But yeah,
there's a double meaning there.
Yeah. Speaking of the wrong market, Bernard, I've been looking. I've just created a new Twitter list of right-wing nutters, which I have already followed too many. I've been trying to eliminate them, but then now because of Tucker Carlson interviewing was the true war criminal of the Second World War, not Adolf Hitler, as we've all been led to believe. I've decided to start pulling some of these things together. So I unfortunately I'm now following him and Candace Owens, who's equally nutty. And what I find puzzling is how quickly their views spread through New Zealand and New Zealand Twitter or New Zealand X. And now, of course, I'm giving it air on New Zealand's most sophisticated podcast. Bernard, I've lost all of your sound. You've muted. Yeah, you've muted.
Yeah. So
Jesus Christ. Simon can't fix up your muting. What? Carry on.
No. And that's going to be cut out in the edit. So I'm in favour of the Brazilian approach to Twitter.
You mean the Brazilian? What kind of Brazilian are you talking about?
This is
You're not talking about
Brazil
shaving.
has shut Twitter down completely.
Yes.
Which I think is the correct approach for dealing with that network. And I increasingly, it's useful to if you tune it right. But what I've noticed lately,
it's getting harder and harder to tune to any way that's civilized, though.
Yeah, and Elon is in there twiddling the dials, A, to make sure that everyone sees his stuff
Yep.
and his amplification of all sorts of nutty things. But, he is full on screwing the scrum of Twitter to do its thing. And it's interesting to see that...
Screwing the scrum. Is that a New Zealand expression?
Yeah, it is. But like
it's actually, the expression is actually a little different, isn't it?
No. That's where you push in the wrong direction when you shouldn't. Usually get penalised. So that is my approach to Twitter. Now on media this week, I thought it would be interesting to mention some of the stuff around Rupert Murdoch, and it looks like there's a big fight going on.
With the family.
Yes.
Over absolutely.
Who gets what?
It's a doozy, though, as we say.
Yes, it's real succession stuff. It's hard to believe that. Sadly, it's a bit like the episode of The Simpsons with Donald Trump as the president that was made in the year 2000.
Well, let's remember also who made The Simpsons. Rupert Murdoch.
No,
well,
he got lucky.
It wouldn't be there. It wouldn't be there without him. Nor would that film Solaris. Nor would all sorts of things. He keeps people employed.
I'd happily give up The Simpsons. Here you go. This shows you how serious I am. I'd happily give up The Simpsons if it also meant we didn't have The Sun or definitely Fox News.
So tell me about. Do you want to tell people what the Rupert Murdoch story is, the succession story? Because it is quite a good one.
No, you go for it. I suspect you're more familiar with it.
I'm very familiar with it. I'm not actually involved in it because I am not the bastard child of Rupert Murdoch, although I did think I could be at one point, and one of my bosses is in fact the bastard child, not literally a bastard child, but is the son that Rupert never had. Yeah, so Rupert is seeking to change the family trust, which his former wife Anna Murdoch made him sign when they got divorced in one of the most expensive divorce settlements ever made. She could have taken, of course, because it was under a California law, she could have taken half of all of Rupert's assets, which, since he sold them slightly later for $70 billion, most of them to Disney for the Fox assets, the 20th Century Fox assets, was rather a lot. So she insisted that he set up a family trust for their children plus Prudence, Prudence is from his first marriage. James, I can't believe I do actually know all this. James, Lachlan, and Elizabeth with an S are from the second marriage to Anna Murdoch, who was a great stalwart, and his two children with Wendy Deng are not part of the trust other than as cash recipients, and they're not directly shareholders in the company. I very much doubt he will be having children with his fifth wife, the Russian person that he's just married recently. Although I did hear the other day a story from my friend Michael Wolff that each new wife gets a guarantee of $15 million a year minimum for as long as they stay. Anyway, Rupert is trying to change the terms of the trust to ensure that Lachlan Murdoch, who is theoretically somewhat more right wing than James, who is I don't know which one we think of as James on Succession anymore, but Shiv is most definitely Elizabeth. So Rupert is trying to change the family trust. I think it's in Nevada, in order to ensure that Lachlan remains in control, and therefore that the Fox legacy stays ideologically, or the News Corp legacy to some extent, stays ideologically where it is now. But
and it really matters.
Which brings me to we talked about the bastard child. He's neither a bastard nor a child, but the Robert Thompson, the CEO of News Corporation, which still retains the newspapers and the Sky Australia, but not Fox, is often widely regarded as the son that Rupert never had. And he doesn't have a stake in the trust, but I think he's done quite well out of it. But this will also affect the political approach, if you like, in the long term of those News Corp papers. But you're right, it's a very successionist thing.
And it really matters for the climate because, from memory, James...
You're doing a segue, aren't you?
I planned this one.
Smooth.
Smooth. So it really matters for the climate because you'd have to argue, without Fox News and Rupert Murdoch, and particularly in later years, his funding and fostering of climate denial, you'd have to say, we might have a different climate on climate. And it's interesting that James Murdoch essentially left in frustration, in large
Different
part.
climate on climate.
Yep. And left in frustration because of the reporting and approach that Fox was taking on climate. And also Elizabeth, too, has been involved in various climate charities and various other things.
Well, the good thing is that all the kids, and in fact Rupert, have sailing super yachts. They don't have powered super yachts. They have sailing super yachts. So they're doing their bit.
Yeah. So it is interesting. And we bring in Catherine to talk about climate misinformation. In this week's Climate Wrap, Catherine's had a closer look at what's going on with climate misinformation, and also how climate activists and people who want to make a difference should actually respond. Catherine, tell us about...
Catherine, before you embark on this, can we make sure that because I don't always, misinformation is the accidental distribution of information that happens to be incorrect. Disinformation is the deliberate.
That's the one
spreading of it. What are we talking about?
So I accidentally said misinformation.
No. Please, I just think it's really important to. I mean, it's a bit, balancing how many angels on a pin. But I think it is important about the deliberate spread as opposed to the accidental.
I totally agree. I was just thinking about that distinction before I came on and planning to make it. So that's brilliant.
Great.
Yep. So there's been a bit of a debate going on behind the scenes in climate circles over the last few weeks around this topic of climate disinformation and misinformation as well. And so there was an article that came out in the Jacobin, which is a kind of a left-wing journal, from an American Holly Buck. And she was basically saying that all of this focus that we've had over the last few weeks or few months, in fact, on climate disinformation. So it's been coming out of, those Senate hearings about what Big Oil knew and what they told everybody and how they acted on it. She was basically saying that it's a big distraction and that climate intellectuals and the media should be focusing more on the funding that is landing on the ground as a result of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, that they ought to be trying to kind of knit people together and who are working on resilience and create a narrative that really inspires people and fuels motivation rather than waging a war on information that's focused on uncovering what Big Oil knew and on policing speech. So her assumption in all of that was that climate disinformation does very little to curtail climate action on the ground. And that's a very arguable thing when we see the amount of public funding that's going into projects that are supported and lobbied for by Big Oil that sit on top of this kind of layer cake of disinformation about what actually works and what's actually happening. So within a week there was a rebuttal, or the next episode of that journal that came out, there was a strong rebuttal that was put in there by a guy called Regenberg, who said that she is largely underestimating the political versus the technical obstacles to decarbonisation. So most of the problems that stop us from decarbonising are actually political and not technical. That the industrial scale of disinformation that comes from Big Oil is actually really shifting dollars around and shifting policy and makes a big difference and has a big impact on what happens on the street. And that if we don't deal with it, then, we're doing ourselves a disservice. And also suggesting that the climate, that climate activists can walk and chew gum at the same time, that we can have frames that address on the street stuff in a different way to the way we address disinformation. So, and this whole argument was also featured as story of the week on the website Skeptical Science, which some people may be familiar with. It was started up out of the University of Queensland some years ago, and they do quite a bit of work on this idea of disinformation. And they were basically saying that that downplaying or ignoring that level of intentional deceit that's been delivered on an industrial scale is a bit like wishing...
Intentional deceit, that's a new one.
Yeah, yep, those are the words.
And I think it's very real. I've noticed, and others have as well, that, for example, Twitter the algorithmic feed is really pushing Elon Musk comments in particular, but it's very quickly turns to stuff being pushed in front of you, which that's not what I really want to see. Not necessarily that we only want to see the things that we agree with, but we're talking nasty and often wrong stuff. So I think, and there's just been an interesting set of accusations from the US government against Russian online interference with the US elections. So I think it's a real thing, the deliberate flooding of the zone with this disinformation.
Yeah, and you have to remember that disinformation, it is there to serve a particular purpose. So they know they're saying something that is untrue, and they're doing it to serve an agenda. And that agenda is not free speech or democracy or anything like that. It is to serve their own personal agenda at the expense of the people who believe that information, and the rest of us, of course. So I find it, I do find it a little bit, I don't know, to suggest that this is about free speech. That's nonsense. It's about power, and who had the power to set the narrative in the conversation, and who has the power to get their narrative out in front of people and have it be acted on, even if it's not true.
Yes,
and that's dangerous. That's really an issue we need to.
Yeah, and if you were really serious about this, and you realised that you needed to do something desperate, I'd be taking the Brazilian route of getting rid of Twitter.
I'm very concerned about this Brazilian route thing. It's a very, I can actually tell you a story about how the Brazilian came about, but
no. So that is that's the.
Are you censoring me, Bernard?
That's exactly. So that is the climate disinformation story. But interestingly, this is all about political debate and information systems. But the climate doesn't care. The planet's not listening. It's doing its own thing. Tell us what the planet is actually doing or reacting to the amount of carbon dioxide and other emissions in the atmosphere.
Yeah, well, we have the final score in for August, and August 2024 was 1.49 degrees hotter than the pre-industrial average, occurred according to the Copernicus dataset, which is run out of the EU. That number was a tie with 2023. So August 2024 was just as hot as 2023. Except that in 2023, we had El Nino happening, which was amplifying temperatures and raising them. It didn't explain all of the anomaly in 2023. But now we have that same anomaly this year, and we don't have El Nino at all as an explanation, because that ENSO system has been neutral for the last couple of months. So the El Nino ended sometime back in Mayish. And isn't a part of the picture anymore, and yet we still sat at nearly 1.5 degrees hotter than the pre-industrial average in August. So that's very worrying. I did sort of go looking for some kind of sign of good news that those anomalies are starting to shrink a bit, and I've put some charts in the weekly climate wrap that look at not just the air surface temperature, but the sea surface temperature as well. And they're kind of the same thing, but the signal is a lot clearer in the sea surface temperatures, where you can actually see the anomaly in terms of the difference in temperature versus the pre-industrial average, the anomaly going up and up and up in 2023, and then in 2024 it starts high and starts to come down, and they actually cross over around.
So that the anomaly
July,
becomes
August.
normal. Is that what you mean? That the anomaly becomes...
It does not. No, it hasn't become normal, but it does show that it has been going down. So the amount hotter we are versus the pre-industrial average is slowly coming down. The question mark is what happens the rest of the year, but because it is still way higher than anybody predicted or where it ought to be. So yeah.
So the background story, it still seems that there has been an acceleration in the warming of the planet, and we're starting to challenge some of the tipping points around the thawing of the Arctic caps and the release of methane, and the melting of the glaciers, which increases the albedo effect, which is to warm the oceans, and where the ice used to be.
Oh, interesting. You say albedo, because I say albedo.
You say tomato.
albedo.
I say tomato.
I say cumin, and Simon says cumin, apparently,
Yeah,
which I found a bit scary, but yeah.
Yeah. So it has been warm and warmer, getting warmer, and of course that creates these extraordinary climate events.
Yeah, we know that there's tipping points that come in around 1.5. We're not supposed to be getting to 1.5 until kind of the 2030s. But the fact that we're there at the moment without El Nino affecting things, yeah.
And we're going to talk a bit more about this towards the end of the show when we have Caroline Shaw, a researcher into public health and in particular the effects of cycling versus driving, and that we'll talk about how that plays out in the public finances, because this week has been a big one for government decisions on transport. And as I reported in the Dawn Chorus day before yesterday, I think it was, we had Simeon Brown, the driver-in-chief of the nation. And
did you see that he put up a video of himself actually driving a car recently? Because the myth is apparently that he's too young to drive. Well, it doesn't have his own license. Doesn't have a license. So either he was having a driving lesson with somebody with a video in the passenger seat, or he does in fact have his license.
Yeah, I suspect that is disinformation, that he doesn't have a license.
Yeah, but it's one of those things. It's a little bit like the Neil Kinnock joke about when Peter Mandelson won a northern seat in England, where he said that Peter Mandelson mistook mushy peas for avocado dip. It's one of those things that you just want to be true because it just seems so fantastically ridiculous.
Mm. Fantastic. Catherine, thank you very much for coming on. It's great to have you on again.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. And we welcome in Robert Patman in Living Colour from a different location. Lovely to see you,
Wellington
Robert.
Airport.
Yes.
Oh, are you? Are you going international? Are you coming up to Auckland?
No, I am coming up to Auckland tomorrow, but I'm just been speaking in Wellington, so returning from that.
Have you? Are you talking bollocks to other people instead of just us?
Much better than us.
Well, you know how I like to spread it around.
Yeah, because I've got tickets to come and hear you talk bollocks in Auckland on Saturday.
Oh, well done.
Yeah,
It should be good.
Achieving peace in an unjust world. That's quite a formidable mission.
I'm bringing martinis in a thermos, which may not be absolutely optimal given the Muslim nature of the audience that you're speaking to. But I'll keep it hidden.
Great. Over to you, Peter, on the international events. I've been very focused.
Right, so Helena's going to join us at the moment in a minute, but
I think Peter's just frozen.
He has a bit.
What are they saying to you is aggravating them? Is it Gaza or here she is? Here she is.
Hi,
Helen, how lovely to see you.
I can see and hear you.
Have you been for a swim today too?
No, I've been to the gym.
Yeah, because Bernard's hair always gives it away that he's been for a naked swim at Waiheke, and I think I know where you are, so I've been wondering whether you had a swim, and you've got Robert Patman on with us as well.
Good.
Now we're going to start with international affairs. Now, let me explain to the audience what I wanted to do, because I was dropping some mail to Helen about this week, and again, not to turn Helen into the one-person leader of the opposition, although she does do that job extremely well. I've asked Helen to sort of stay through the Robert session, or what I think of as the Peter session, actually, but it's really the Robert session, into the domestic session, because there's so much that Helen speaks wisely about. And I know our audience really, really appreciates what she says. Now, Helen, I thought we might start with Israel-Gaza. Is that a valid?
Sure.
I mean, you had some responsibility at one point for UNRWA. We have this strange situation now at the moment where the ceasefire is not going ahead, where Netanyahu has drawn a red line down what's called the Philadelphia corridor between Gaza and Egypt. I mean, what's your take on the sort of geopolitics, in a sense, that's being played there at the moment?
Well, clearly it's complicated on every level. actually, prior to the tragedy of the hostages being executed, as presumably Israeli Defense Forces were closing in on their position, Netanyahu had been enjoying at least some revival of his political fortunes. And then when the hostages were killed, that seemed to flip again, with people just, so angry, knowing that most of these hostages, if not all, but at least most, would have been on a list for prisoner exchange with Palestinians. And then because the ceasefire never happens, they're dead. So it's completely devastating for the families. And to see those huge demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of people in Israel saying, look, we just want it to stop, if there's to be any chance of getting our loved ones back. So then we step back a minute. There is a point of view which says that while the US says we want a ceasefire and we're pursuing talks and so on, that in a way this could be seen as a holding action to try to keep Iran back off from retaliating over the killing in a government guest house of the political leader of Hamas. So the extent to which the current administration in the US really wants a ceasefire is a moot point, or was it just a tactical gambit? Meanwhile, one of the most significant developments of recent days was the British Foreign Secretary announcing that Britain was suspending about a tenth, I think, of the arms contracts that they have with Israel, but obviously areas that identified as being particularly, lethal in Gaza. And while it, was a small step, nonetheless, it's an important step because the UK has been a pretty unqualified supporter on all sides of the political spectrum. But the tragedy is, just when you think things can't get worse in Gaza, they get worse.
Yeah, they get worse. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not particularly optimistic. We're playing now through the politics of the US election campaign. Obviously, Trump will somehow try to weaponize anything.
Well, did you see, Helen, you probably saw the remarkable story, if it's not true necessarily, but it's been reported that Trump has spoken to Netanyahu. They both denied it and said essentially no ceasefire until I'm in the White House.
Well, doesn't this remind you of the election campaign where Nixon basically contrived to stop the Democrats getting a ceasefire or an agreement on Vietnam? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's exactly right. Trump wants to be credited with ending this. Trump, of course, has particular links to the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia. He wants those Abrahamic Accords between Israel and Saudi to go ahead, just as they've already gone ahead with Bahrain and with United Arab Emirates. So he wants to be seen as the one who brought a stop to all this. But there's still 2 months of slaughter to go, and then there's all of the rest of November, December through to late January before anyone's sworn in. So it is actually disgusting and disgraceful that people's lives continue to be needlessly lost because of the way the American political system is dealing with this.
And Helen, what is there, before I move to Robert to bring poor old Robert in? Helen, are there things that when you see? I mean, Winston Peters seems to have been, as foreign minister rather than as Winston Peters as such, but been very even-handed in this so far. Been condemnatory of the urged a two-state solution. All those things. Are there things that New Zealand should be doing differently?
Absolutely. I mean, New Zealand has been a pretty faint voice, if we're frank. Although Winston, historically in his terms as foreign minister, has been more open-minded on this than some. But what they should certainly do is accept diplomatic representation from the state of Palestine. They've refused to do that. Another statement they've made is they've issued, I think, 2 statements now between the leaders of New Zealand, Australia, and Canada on views on the situation on Israel-Gaza. Now, I think New Zealand has gone for far too low a common denominator on those statements. I think we're better than that. And I also would draw attention to the fact that they say in their statement, here we are thousands of miles away, that Hamas should form no part of any future government's arrangement for Gaza. Well, who are we to say this? Winston himself pointed out years ago when Hamas first won the election and others wanted to sanction.
That it was the second only democratically elected government in the Middle East.
That's right. They did win an election. And while the Israeli campaign is aimed at, quote, eliminating Hamas, you won't eliminate an idea or a social and political movement. So let's get to grips with that. We may not like its leaders, who are, pretty deadly men, but they have had quite a lot of support. One would have hoped it would have diminished with what they've led their people into. But nonetheless, just to sit thousands of miles away and say they can't play any role in the future, that's not the position that I would think that Fatah and the PLO will take. They know in the end there's got to be a broad tent.
Yeah, Robert, how are you seeing this at the moment? I was also struck today. There's been overnight. There's been Israeli provocateurs, if you like, going onto the Temple Mount, as did the minister last week. I think we talked about that even in the last week's poll. How are you seeing this at the moment?
Well, I absolutely agree with Helen and her assessment. I would like to add to that with respect to the American position, we hear from the administration, from Mr. Biden and from Ms. Harris, the presidential contender, that they're working around the clock. The time for a ceasefire, in words of both of them, is now. But the problem is, you start to unpack that statement and something quickly becomes obvious to the rest of the world. The United States has the leverage to stop this within hours. It can literally do what Mr. Reagan did in 1982, pick up the phone and tell the Israeli leader, it was Menachem Begin in 1982, that the United States would no longer support the invasion of Lebanon, and it stopped rapidly. The Americans have shown no willingness to seriously hold arms to Israel. And the other thing is, to add a layer of complexity to this, the American position, to me, seems to be incoherent, actually, and I don't wish to be rude here, because on the one hand, they keep saying that we're desperate for a ceasefire, and as the reasons we just pointed out, they can actually bring that about. But secondly, Mr. Netanyahu is actually, they're arming a leader whose policies come into conflict with the official position of the United States. Mr. Netanyahu has said, we will, under his leadership, and he's proud of it, there will not be a Palestinian state. That's in direct contradiction to the American position, which is the settlement, there must be a day after, and it must be based on a two-state solution. So why are they generously, I can't think of any, I can think of few historical parallels where a country as powerful as the United States, or even a less powerful country, has armed another country, an ally, when that ally is using those arms for a purpose which is not supported by the donor. This is an extraordinary situation, and it does lead big questions about American motivations.
Helen, may I? But Bernard is bursting to ask a question about a different subject. But let me just ask, and I think we may have touched on this before. I mean, the United Nations has gone in this week, and I think it's so far vaccinated 186,000 children in Gaza. God knows where they can find them and in what circumstances. This is to try to deal with the polio outbreak. Can you describe in a few sentences your understanding of Israel's attitude to the United Nations as a whole, without...
I think Peter's just frozen.
Yeah.
Attacked constantly by various pro-Israel groups in New Zealand.
You just froze a minute there, Peter.
Yeah, UNRWA. Could you talk a little bit about the United Nations, Israel's attitude to the United Nations, and particularly UNRWA, since you've had so much experience with it, and I see various Israeli groups in New Zealand or Israeli supporting groups attacking you personally about that.
I don't even notice them, must have them blocked. So, look, Israel doesn't like the UN a great deal. The General Assembly has long been on the record of, supporting quite strongly a two-state solution and condemning illegal settlements. The Security Council, the US there, has given protection to Israel, although occasionally the US will relax its guard a little and let a resolution that's mildly critical go through. But in general, Israel doesn't have a great deal of respect for the UN. Now, on the issue of UNRWA, this is very specific. UNRWA, the full name is the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. And Israel does not want to see the descendants of those who were displaced when Israel declared itself a state. It does not want to see those descendants who fled to Jordan, to Syria, to Lebanon, to Egypt, etc. It doesn't want to see them as refugees. So the very existence of UNRWA runs up against that. And it is on a campaign to get rid of UNRWA. Hence, it makes false claims against it. Remember, it made those claims which led to a lot of countries suspending their funding to UNRWA. And then when the UN held a formal inquiry conducted independently by a former French foreign minister, Israel offered no evidence whatsoever for its assertions, refused to engage. So the UNRWA has to be defended because it is the biggest provider on the ground of health and education services. And many will tell you that you can't actually deliver relief and development into Gaza without UNRWA.
Helen, just to shift to another part of the planet now, we've had a report out from the security establishment here in New Zealand about the activities of state hackers, if you like, and as part of this overall debate about AUKUS.
You mean from China, Bernard?
Possibly, and the other states, yes. Although these reports from the security services are never very, they don't always put those names in the headline. But I wondered, the reports have talked about the need with AUKUS 2, Pillar 2, to get access to some of the fanciest tech that the Americans might have just to block these cyber attacks. What did you make of this report this week?
Well, I don't think Pillar 2 would be of much utility with that. The reality is that New Zealand has quite good and functioning relationships with US signals intelligence, which stand quite independently of any future arrangement under AUKUS. So they can't use that as an excuse for wanting it. Look, I was minister for these agencies for 9 years. I know a great deal about them and the arrangements that they have. No, Pillar 2 is a different beast, and the optics of it are that if you go into it, you're signing up basically to be part of the containment strategy around China, and that's not good for a country like ours, which has been seen as more an honest broker, wanting to engage with all sides, and not taking these fixed positions. What's been very interesting to see is the volume of opposition from highly credible and senior people in Australia, even to AUKUS Pillar 1. And it's now emerging in the UK as well. Two very senior former defence security personnel have come out against the folly of AUKUS Pillar 1. And I think are seeing Britain in its current stretched fiscal environment, which, and let's face it, has run down its defence forces. The attitude is, why are we committing to subs in the Pacific? We've got issues closer to home. And that's an issue, a point I've continued to make about the strange set of announcements from Germany to Italy and no doubt others of defence ministers visiting the Philippines and saying, oh, we're signing up to support the Philippines in the Pacific. Excuse me, they've got a war in Europe. Would they please focus on that and getting some resolution there, rather than sticky beak behaviour around here? So
sticky beak. Oh, is that what you used to say at the UN? Stop being a bloody sticky beak. I like that. So just to use another expression like that, Robert, the Chinese embassy here today was a bit stroppy about this this SIS report, saying, calling it, I think, undiplomatic and part of the Civil War ethos. They're getting a bit toey here, aren't they? Just to use another New Zealand, we've got sticky beak, stroppy, and toey.
Well, I mean, if they were interfering, we should not be shocked. They're an authoritarian state, and they've got few tools of soft power when dealing with a liberal democracy. And foreign interference is not a new thing. It's been going on for some time. And if they were involved, they weren't going to admit it anyway. States never do. So, I mean, we've got to, you've got to have this a pinch of salt. But I want to come back to something Helen said, which I think is really important, regarding Pillar 2 and the whole Chinese interference thing. I think one of the reasons there's now real pushback in Australia and in the UK is because the penny has dropped. That AUKUS was sold on the basis that China was the major threat to the international rules-based system, which most middle powers and small powers in the world depend on. They strategically depend on it. And the penny has dropped. Actually, there's a multiplicity of threats to the rule of law internationally, and it's not just China. Now, that gives us no great pleasure, because I think it would have been much better strategically if the United States had acted as Ben Rhodes has pointed out, former advisor to President Obama, it would be much better strategic if the United States had walked the talk on upholding the rules-based order and said to Mr. Netanyahu at the outset, as Naya Mihut specified at the outset, that they would back Israel's attempt to bring Hamas to account, providing it was fully consistent with international law and humanitarian law in particular. That condition was never laid down by the United States. And the United States has basically taken a sort of blank check approach, which is completely inconsistent with the position it takes internationally. I mean, after all, let's be quite clear about this. This is a moral crisis for Gaza is a moral crisis for the United States, because US foreign policy purportedly is based on universal values, which do not make those distinctions between Palestinians and Israelis. But through the eyes of the world, at the moment, Palestinian eyes look a lot less valuable than Israeli lives. And that's a perception which is going to be very difficult to unravel, and it's having spillover now for things like AUKUS.
Well, Robert's absolutely right, and there's a word that starts with H. It's called hypocrisy. And to so many countries, they're looking at the differential approach of the US to the Ukraine-Russia war vis-a-vis the tragedy in Gaza. There's very selective application of the rules-based order by the United States itself. And another example we could throw in is from the trade world, where basically they've pulled the pin on the WTO, which doesn't have an effective disputes resolution mechanism anymore, because they have refused to permit judges to be appointed to the appellate court. So, time for some looking in the mirror, I think, and for all to see, there's just very selective upholding of a so-called rules-based order. And let's remember, the rules-based order, quote unquote, was developed when most of today's member states of the UN were colonized by the very West, which now does the lecturing.
Great. Helen, may I ask you to stay on a little bit, because I talked to you about stretching you across the international to the international. Now, and Robert, thank you so much, and I'll see you on Saturday. I'll try not to let the martinis
goodbye to everyone
odor be present. See you.
That's great.
Bye bye.
Helen, I was really struck noticing you and someone we both know at the hung at the Hui yesterday in Turangawaiwai. And I've been wanting to ask you, it's really a personal question in a way on this in front of everybody, about your sense at the moment of the threats to the treaty and whether that concerns you given everything. I mean, I was also, I'm going to double this up as one of my world's longest questions issues. You've weirdly, to me, unified with or joined with Don Brash on AUKUS, but Don Brash also takes a view on, or at least the Hobson's Choice takes a pledge, rather, I keep calling it Hobson's Choice, takes a view on seabed and foreshore, which will be both familiar to you, but is rather provocative, it seems. Given where you've been yesterday and before we go to Caroline, maybe you could just address what you think is the current perspective on Te Tiriti.
So obviously I have not made common cause with Don on those issues. Our engagement is around the independent foreign policy, and that's where it will stay. But yes, I was at Te Ranawaiwa yesterday. In my time in leadership in New Zealand politics, I was very close to the King movement. I had the senior Māori colleagues who were very close and always paved the way for me to go. I remember Dame Te Ata's tangi as if it were yesterday. So it brought back so many memories to be there. But there's no doubt that this is a time where Māoridom feels under tremendous threat. And probably the silliest thing that could have been done is to have come to Parliament a bill which sets to define the principles of the treaty, because a treaty by definition was
exactly which other ones do we want to renegotiate? Yeah.
So you can't legislate over that without being the kind of state that, frankly, we don't want to be seen to be, to put it in a nutshell. So that bill is the silliest, but it goes along with so many other things where Māoridom feels they've made some progress and now the rug's been pulled away.
And Helen, what about do you agree with Don Brash's Hobson's pledge thing about the seabed and the foreshore, and that's all at risk as well? Given, and I started reading it up because I was away overseas when you had your clash over that. Are you supporting or are you endorsing what the Hobson's pledge people are doing?
My reflection on this is that if, when I was PM, we had advice to do what the 2011 legislation did, we would have done it. We were looking for solutions. And I thought the 2011 legislation was quite elegant in declaring that the area belonged to no one. And then, gave Māori a route.
Through customary rights, you mean?
Yeah, through customary rights. Yeah. So, our courts have become a bit adventurous. It's fair to say, but when you're faced with a challenge like this, I think my reflection would be it's better to go back and try and talk it through, and that's really not happening on any level.
Okay. Look, Helen, thank you so much for being in and stretching yourself so ably across both international affairs and I hope you go out and get some pippies at medium tide.
Heaven knows what's happened to the pippies.
Yeah. If you're not bloody allowed to get them anymore. All right. See you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helen.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers.
Hi, Catherine. Sorry to have made you wait.
All good.
No. Caroline, welcome into the Hoon. Caroline Shaw, who is a public health researcher at the University of Otago, Wellington. Caroline, you've been busy doing a whole bunch of research which has come out today, and you've got an article in the Conversation which we will link to in the show notes with this podcast. But firstly, this week's been a big one too for decisions about transport funding. What did you think of the government's decision to halve planned funding for cycling and walking from $1 billion between 21-24 and 24 and 27 and 460 million now? Interestingly, actually using money that wasn't spent in the last 3-year period. What did you think of that, the government's overall shift, which is away from cycling and walking, and you'd have to argue public transport, towards double cab utes? That's a bit rude, but
I mean, it's a pretty underwhelming set of policies, really. Obviously, there's been this announcement, but that was sort of reasonably well flagged in the draft government policy statement for transport. And then, of course, there's been emissions reduction plan draft 2 as well. So and then some specific policy moves to disestablish things like the clean car discount. So collectively, these add up to a pretty regressive set of policies for transport, which are, a massive opportunity cost in terms of the money that could be spent on low carbon transport options.
and also a massive opportunity cost in terms of institutional capabilities and sort of time and resource that is being spent on roading projects rather than getting the capacity to increase and enhance public transport, cycling and walking projects.
Because one of the things that not a lot of people are aware of is the real health costs of increasing amount of driving, but also driving with fossil fuel powered cars. Could you talk a bit more about the costs of more driving, but more importantly, not cycling and walking so much, or taking buses and trains?
Yeah, this is a really interesting issue, and it always surprises me that we don't have a better understanding collectively as a country about how unhealthy the transport system is. So we know there's been research that I've been involved in and lots of other people have been involved in over the years documenting how many people are dying each year prematurely because of the way that we arrange our transport system currently. So there's thousands of premature deaths every year because of air pollution. There's tens of thousands of injuries that are really avoidable. And the whole settings of the transport system essentially mean that it's really difficult to walk and cycle and take public transport. So, collectively, it's at least as great as the health loss from tobacco every year, probably quite a lot larger, to be honest, that we are currently losing in terms of health. And of course, in a massively overstrained health system, this matters quite a lot. Most of these admissions are really completely avoidable. So, we're just creating work for hospitals that don't need it.
Yeah, and you've done some research looking at alternatives. I'm a bit like to talk about economics, and the government certainly likes to talk about economics and economic choices. But there are choices that you could make in terms of a transition to net zero in a couple of different ways. Could you tell us about the research that you've published today on the two different pathways we could take, and which ones are best for our health and the overall state of the nation?
Sure. So the Climate Change Commission in 2021, they published their big report, Inaia Tonu Nei, and they, as part of the work they did for that, mapped out 7 different approaches that we could take to get to net zero, because obviously we can make choices about the emphasis of policies and so forth. And we took the 2 most different pathways in there, and we said for transport, and we said, okay, well, what would the health implications of these 2 pathways be? And we compared them to the 2018 transport system, as if that carried on forward. And the good news is that both of them are better than what we currently have. So that's a plus. But the one that promotes, that has the higher level of VKT reduction, so, fewer kilometres travelled each year per person, higher levels of cycling, higher public transport and higher walking, unsurprisingly, has much higher health benefits and much higher savings for the health system as well. Interestingly, if you look at life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of the 2 scenarios, they're roughly about the same. So the other scenario, which was much heavier on electric vehicles, when you take into account all the manufacturing and destruction life cycle emissions, actually they're pretty similar at the end of the day. So you're not trading off any environmental benefit, and you're gaining a lot of health benefit by taking a pathway that promotes active transport, public transport, dense cities, all of those things that would make our lives much better.
One of the concerns people have about the current government is that it talks a lot about being focused on economic growth, that it's really about making the boat go faster. And when they talk about the boat, they're talking about GDP growth. But if you were doing a proper economic analysis of these decisions that are being made, you could argue a wellbeing framework, or even an actuarial approach measurement of these decisions. The opportunity costs, for example, the money that's being spent on motorways may have a benefit to cost ratio of 1 or 2 to 1, whereas the money that you could spend on cycleways and walkways, according to international research I've seen, could be closer to $15 for every $1 spent, or even more. How would you measure this properly in a true not economic sense, which takes into account the health costs and the environmental costs, long term and the opportunity costs of doing it the other way.
I mean, I think we have already taken into account the health costs, so it's pretty clear that you can do that, and it's sure it took us a wee while to kind of get all our model together, but it's certainly not impossible, and other people internationally have done it as well. Taking the greenhouse gas emissions costs into account is, that's not sort of rocket science either. I think the main problem here is not so much the quantification, although of course we can always do better on that. The main problem is actually including that in the decision making, and that actually being valued in the decision making as a genuine output.
Yeah, because I had a look through the National Land Transport Program announcement this week and the comments from the Minister, which were very much along the lines of it's just natural and good and obvious that saving a minute and a half by having a 4-lane motorway is worth it, that somehow this is going to increase GDP. Interestingly, he used the word freight. A lot of these motorways are not necessarily making freight faster, and also the speed limit changes he's talked about won't make that freight faster because the truck speed limits are still at 90 kilometres an hour. But also, it strikes me a lot of these decisions about just make the boat go faster, have more cars going faster, and it's all about the time saving. Doesn't take into account the social costs, the health costs, or the climate costs, or the down the line costs of induced demand from wonderful motorways. Yeah, well, I'll buy a third car and I'll drive around a lot more.
Are you doing a soliloquy in the middle of an interview?
Well,
I'm not disagreeing with any of this.
I know. I'm trying to break your record for the longest question, Peter.
Yeah. You just have, I think, by about 2 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Caroline, are there any good examples of places that do it properly, do a good analysis of how this could go?
Wales has banned time savings as an outcome that you can use to justify roads.
Wow.
There's just literally no reason to do it at all, and it's utterly devoid of meaningful value as well. So you have this time saving, you put an economic kind of number on it, and there's a whole lot of gender related issues around that, about whose time you're counting and whose you aren't. But also, you're not actually asking people whether you would rather save 30 seconds of time on your journey or an extra 2 children a year die because they've been hit by large cars that we drive around our cities. So none of there's sort of a values-free kind of approach to it, which I think if you actually went and asked people those questions, they would probably give you different answers. But I think having VKT reduction as the outcome that you're aiming for rather than time saving, I think California, maybe does that. So there's different ways of doing it.
We know they've done brilliantly on traffic over the years, yeah. And they're going to have a car-free Olympics, apparently.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Karen, may I ask you a question on this? Because and I know I don't mean to ask you to stretch apart from that gorgeous piece of tapa you have behind you, which is a fantastic backdrop that I might... Tonga? Thank you. I was wondering where
beautiful, from Vava'u.
We talk a little bit on this show sometimes about the likelihood that the government is going to let the climate goals slip away, probably wait for another couple of countries to say that they're not going to meet them, and then say, well, poor little New Zealand never could have met it. From what you've said, it sounds like we're miles away from the well-being budget. Is that what's happening there? There isn't a whole of government approach?
No,
I'm not trying to say that Jacinda got it absolutely right, but
there's decisions happening in transport at the moment that are going to kill more people. Like, let's be completely clear about that. The speed limit increases, more people will die. Mm-hmm. Expansion of roads and expansion of driving, more people are exposed to injury risk and die. They're less physically active. There's an association between spending more time in your car and being physically sort of getting the chronic diseases and that sort of thing. So it's utterly clear that these are the decisions that are being made at this point, and it's incredibly disappointing when we are talking about being more efficient, reducing our budget and so forth, that we could be making choices that achieve a whole lot of policy outcomes that we claim that we're interested in.
And be happier? And be
happier.
Sort of happier and feel wealthier? Is that possible?
Be happier. Like, if we are more physically active, we know that that has a massive impact on mental health. And we have a mental health crisis going on at this point in time that we cannot create enough services to deal with that. We need public health interventions to improve mental health. And physical activity, we know that inadequate physical activity is responsible for 1 in 10 cases of depression. So increasing physical activity through transport is one of the most effective things we could do to improve population mental health in this country.
Bernard,
Caroline,
I'm sorry, you're busting to ask the last one.
Yes, no, this is just the last question, Caroline. I'm a reader of The Economist, and there's an article in the last week or so on The Economist, which you may have seen or not, which looks at the effects on numbers of pedestrian deaths and deaths in cars because of the growth in the size of vehicles. We talk about feeling wealthier. We've also been driving around in heavier, wider, higher, we call them double cab utes, cars. What is
them Range Rovers where I live, Bernard.
Range Rovers, Ford Rangers. Ford Ranger Nation we have become. What is the implications for our health system and our health, apart from anything else, of this increasing size of our cars?
So for pedestrians and cyclists, it's pretty awful. We know that for every sort of extra 100 kilos of weight, the chance of death goes up something like 3% for pedestrians. So, and increasingly the upsizing of cars is understood to have been creating all of these international trends in increasing pedestrian and cyclist deaths. The other thing, of course, is that these cars produce more air pollution. So for our already really bad levels of nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, and the fact that the vehicle emission standards for these cars have been completely savaged in policy recently. So we're going to have a legacy of this high level of air pollution and the really high level of health harm we have from it. I think we have world-leading levels of health harm from nitrogen dioxide in this country, which is almost entirely from transport. So, this is another really sort of awful trend for health that is occurring in the transport system.
Caroline, wonderful to have you on. It's been a really interesting and eye-opening chat about health and transport. It's great to talk about these things when our minister and the general thrust of the government has been to not talk about the wider, deeper implications of these policies. And it just seems to me ironic at best that we've got a government announcing that it plans to spend a lot of money to make cars go faster and have more cars
I like
drive
fast
more.
cars, I love the way that you've done the data heavy understanding of the implications that you've presented today. I just find very powerful. Thank you very much.
Been great talking to you both.
Yep. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Please do come again. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
there'll unfortunately be plenty more to talk about with transport and public health, I'm sure. Thank you very much. Lovely to see you.
Thanks so much.
And that is another Hoon.
Well, wait a second.
This
We've
week.
got some skateboarding dogs, haven't we?
I know. And
Oh, have you got one?
No.
'Cause we haven't done much pre-editing today. As poor old Simon must be sitting there pulling out whatever little hair he's actually got when we get to this stage, and he realizes that we've done absolutely very little preparation.
Well, you've got a skateboarding dog, and this I was setting you up to.
Well, I've got two in a way,
it.
actually, because I did research after we discussed Brazilians earlier on. I did remind myself that I wasn't just repeating an urban myth, which is that the concept of a Brazilian came not from Brazil, as you would imagine, but from New York, where a Brazilian person had set up a hair removal place and started offering the very service that you were describing before, not that you were alluding to it.
Yes.
And people would say, have you been to the Brazilian? So therefore, have you got a Brazilian?
Brazilian.
Anyway, the other one, though, is the fantastic line. I think I might have mentioned last week how brilliant Steve Bronius, who was somebody that I know, but I have been completely flabbergasted by the quality of his work from the Polkinghorne trial. And he did something very nice today, was that he shat on Australians in a really nice way. He said, the prospect of listening to an Australian accent all day in court. This is his story about Dr. Death, the Australian pathologist. The prospect of listening to an Australian accent all day in courtroom 11 at the High Court at Auckland was horrifying. But in fact, he had a very pleasant voice, without his country's long, drawn-out vowels, and there was something soothing about his delivery, even though he spoke only about death.
Yeah, I suspect Steve is looking for anything that is not quite so grim as the topic.
Yeah, he's done a beautiful job of it.
Now, I'm sort of surprised he hasn't been scooped up to do a true crime podcast on all these things.
Well, actually, maybe he will now, because he's just published a new true crime book. But I reckon he needs to do something in the New Yorker for this. But anyway, I'll talk to him about that separately. It's lovely to see you today. I really like that woman we just had on.
She's great,
somebody's crapping on me for not asking Helen the right questions, but as you know, that's why you don't look at the comments and I do.
Don't look at the comments.
I mean, I do. Can I just be clear to everybody? One of the reasons I like having Helen on is because she'll come on. She's a good egg, and she's really a serious person across so many of these.
She
issues.
knows a lot of stuff, and she's done
she
a
knows
lot of stuff,
and she's got experience. And if you've got other things you want me to ask her that we can challenge her a bit more, we won't have her on all the time. Although, actually, maybe we should push Robert Patman out and have her.
This is going to be edited out, isn't it? This is good. Peter, on that bombshell, I'd love to say thank you very much.
He's booked fully. And thank you, everybody else, for all the audience. Thank you. I think we had a record today up to 150, probably because of David Mooring putting it on Blue Sky or Mastodon or one of the, Echidna or whatever his social media group is now.
Ka kite anō, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.